Hey everybody, it's Kneecap here, and in this video we have some sneaky, interesting Retribution Paladin changes. So they finally put out some updated PTR patch notes for 11.1, and I went to the ret section, of course, first. That's what I usually do first. And there are very few changes, as you'll see here, but they're quite interesting in some potentially good ways. Shouldn't be negative, but we'll see. So all ability damage increased by 5%. Wow, a 5% buff. That's pretty good, right? On its own. But there is a downside to this as well. Developers' notes for this. Empyrean Hammer's damage output was higher than desired on the overall breakdown. We're distributing the power across the rest of the abilities. So what this is actually doing is it's not a buff. Hammer of Light now benefits from Final Reckoning, and Empyrean Hammer damage reduced by 30%. So if you ever look at your breakdown of abilities, Empyrean Hammer will likely be your top damage. This is a passive ability. You can do things to extend how much damage you do and stuff, but it's mostly a passive ability from Templar, and it's your #1 source of damage. It's ridiculous. I've said it from the beginning. It's ridiculous that that's my top damage. It's like very low skill. I shouldn't say it's no skill because you can extend your Shake the Heavens and stuff, but very, very low, and I never like that at all. I want my actual abilities to do damage personally, and I like having passive things like Empyrean Hammer, but I don't want them to be my #1 damage. So you might be like, well, what's interesting about this? So first of all, you might be like, well, 30% versus 5%. My guess is I haven't pulled up logs yet and like looked and like calculated, but my guess is 5% damage to everything is probably going to about equal this 30% damage reduction to Empyrean Hammer. Sometimes when they do this stuff, they even err on caution and give you extra damage. So like it might be a 1% buff, right? It also could be a 1% nerf. I haven't done the math of this yet. But their goal likely would be to equalize those things. So if you add 5% to all your other abilities other than Empyrean Hammer that do damage, all ability damage, and then you subtract 30% from your Empyrean Hammer, which is your top damage, my guess is that they kind of equal out. I'll do the actual math on this at some point and figure it out for sure, but I've done, every time I end up doing it, it's always extremely close. So I can say with relative certainty that it's going to be very close. So that's that. So what's interesting about that? None of this is super interesting yet. This is just moving damage around. What's interesting is this only affects Templar, right? But the ability damage affects everything. So Herald of the Sun got a 5% buff, and Templar stayed the same. And it's very interesting, especially for AoE. I don't know if this will move the needle on single target or not, but on AoE, with your Empyrean Hammer damage being reduced by so much, all ability damage being increased. So 5% more damage on your Divine Storms, for example, right? So I'm very interested to see if this will fully shift things into Herald of the Sun for Mythic Plus or not. It's a 5% swing, which is a decent swing. I'm not sure that it will. I know the new tier sets in 11.1 favor Templar over Herald of the Sun for sure, but this definitely brings it closer in line. Because again, it's like a 5% buff to Herald of the Sun, while it's a just moving numbers around for Templar. Like Templars, you're going to do basically the same damage if you're Templar, but if you go to Herald of the Sun, your damage is going to increase by 5% on single target, basically. On AoE, who knows what the difference might end up being? That's a little bit more dynamic because you're hitting multiple targets and hitting various amounts of targets. Obviously, if you said, well, 4 targets, this is what it would change, but not knowing, pull to pull and Mythic Plus, for example, how many targets you have, then it's hard to, guarantee the percent change that would be. But yeah, it's very interesting. And, Herald of the Sun is something I've been playing around with on PTR. Again, the tier set works much better with Templar. Or basically, Divine Hammer works better with Templar, and Divine Hammer works better with the tier set. So it's not that the tier set works better with Templar, it's that Divine Hammer got buffed, and it's kind of good now, and Divine Hammer works better with Templar. And then and so it goes through a few steps, but the tier set works better with Templar in that way if you're using Divine Hammer. So I love variation of build. That's something we talk about a lot when we're doing videos on this channel, is talking about how I like the variation. So if nothing else, if this just means like sometimes I play Herald and sometimes I play Templar, that'd be great. I don't necessarily think it will, but it is getting closer to that threshold with that 5% buff there. So some interesting things to take a look at, some interesting things to test on the PTR, all these kind of things like that. So that's what I'll be looking into in the future. If for some reason it is way off, like this is a huge nerf to Templar, or it's actually like a 2% buff, I'll mention that in the next video that I do for Paladins after I do a little bit of napkin math or whatever on this. I'm not gonna put too much into it, but I will check it out and see what it is. If you've already done the math yourself, because I didn't do this video immediately, you can feel free to tell me what you got on your napkin math, or if you are just a mathematician and did the math fully and 100% correctly, that's great too. But yeah, that's it for this one, guys. Kind of interesting. As always, I do ask you to please subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, I encourage you to check out the Patreon. And other than that, everybody, have a good one.